Thank you, everyone. This is Rabbi Israel Salanter's Re-envisioning of Orthodox Judaism with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. I'm going to pass things off to Rabbi David Silber for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Kayla. Welcome, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's lecture and to hear Rabbi Greenberg Yitz, as he's known. Rabbi Greenberg is a leading thinker in the Jewish community, has been and is a leading thinker in the Jewish community. It's been our good fortune at Risha to be able to hear him speak over the many years, different topics that are important for the Jewish communities. Let me just say very quickly two things about Yitz, and not that he needs an introduction, but I'll say them in any event. First of all, Rabbi Greenberg is a traditional Jew who takes modernity seriously. And he's interested in the confrontation between modernity and Jewish traditional life and traditional values. And he addresses a whole range of questions, some of which he was actually a pioneer in addressing. The Shoah, for example, one of the leading voices in addressing the Shoah and putting it in front of us for the entire Jewish community. And the second thing I would say about Rabbi Greenberg is he's been rather consistent over the years. He has essentially a positive outlook, which I would say in Hebrew is lo muvan me'elav. You know, in the last 100 years of world history and certainly Jewish history, it's not always so easy to keep that positive outlook on life. But Rabbi Greenberg has somehow succeeded in doing that and continues to do that. So tonight we are very fortunate that he will be talking about a book which he put out together with Rabbi Justin Pines, the writings of Rabbi Israel Salanter, who was a mid-19th century thinker, the founder of the Muslim movement. Can the words of a mid-19th century thinker help us confront the challenges of modern society? Rabbi Greenberg will enlighten us. Thank you, Rabbi Greenberg, and awaiting your words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Silber. I want to start by thanking Drisha for the opportunity to teach and to talk with you about Rabbi Israel Salanter, who is recognized generally as a great figure of East European Orthodoxy in the 19th century. But I think his greatness and his significance is missed by many, including those who hold him up to be a gadol. What I wanted to do tonight is to describe what I think is his pioneering idea of how Orthodoxy could deal with and become an important positive factor in modern Judaism and modern Jewish community. When he began his work, you might say, particularly in Eastern Europe, Orthodoxy had a monopoly. It was the dominant form. There was, in the century of his life and thereafter, a major movement of growth in secularism and anti-religious Jewish positions. But on the religious side, in Eastern Europe, it would appear that Orthodoxy had the monopoly. But Salanter saw what was coming and was convinced that it was not prepared to function and to be an important positive force in modern life. Of course, he was right, and eventually what happened is that the leadership of the community took the Haredi solution, which is to try to keep out modern, to try to fight it, to try to create a physical and cultural ghetto that would not be influenced by modernity because it couldn't deal with many of the challenges and many of the ideas that were being thrown at the community. Salanter, in the end, helped build that community because he felt it was the only community that still had a strong tradition that could be built on and saved. But his own desire was to create a strategic alternative, a religion and orthodoxy that could integrate in modern life, that could deal with the intellectual and spiritual challenges, most of all, could enrich its own religious life, so that when modernity came and it lost its monopoly, and when every lifestyle, I think even he didn't imagine as what we're living through today, where literally every lifestyle, Jewish and non-Jewish, would become available to people, he was trying to create an alternative before the refuah, before the makkah, before the plague, namely a form of religious approach to life that was so internal and so strong that it could resist. In fact, it could flourish and grow in the new culture, which was so many alternative differences and different values and so on. And I think that road, I still believe, is the only road that's going to work, and the only road that I think we still have to learn how to deal with in a positive way. So I welcome the opportunity to talk about Rabbi Israel. What I would like to do is mostly sketch his religious understanding and his critique of Orthodoxy and his vision of a new Orthodoxy. In many ways, I'd like to say again, it was really not just of Orthodoxy, it was really of the whole tradition at the time when he wrote and spoke. To all practical purposes, Orthodoxy was the tradition, unlike in Western Europe. So let me start with his critique. He himself, his dates, 1810 to 1883. Born in Lithuania, the classic Misnagdic family. His father was an Av Betin, the head of the rabbinic court in the town where he was born. He was an Eloi, a genius, a brilliant student from a very early age, was given special education and special attention as an Eloi. By 1840, and in fact, when I was 30, he was recognized throughout much of Lithuania as a brilliant and towering Torah scholar, and he was invited to come to Vilna to lead a yeshiva and to teach his Torah. By then already, however, he had surpassed the standard Eloi Gadol learning in two ways. One is that he'd become aware that there was more to religious life than learning, and more aware than ever before of the need of the community to develop a higher level religious understanding, because a new era, a new culture was arriving, and he felt they were not prepared for it. So here was his critique. One is that Orthodoxy was dominant and almost universal. There was no serious alternative except secular. But in fact, its actual religious life was much too much external, obedient observances. Much too much of its life was a kind of conformism. He spoke of, in the words of Isaiah, mitzvat anashim melumada. They're doing all the mitzvot, but it's the mitzvah that's done melumada because you're habituated, because you learned it, because that's the only way around. And just as the prophet criticized this, because it's conventional, it's ritual, but it's not depth, it doesn't understand or feel the emotions or the values that are critical. So he warned that was a real danger, that the community had to redo itself, to move from this kind of conformist, obedient, conventional observance. By the way, he called it conformist because he recognized that people kept these mitzvot sometimes to the littlest detail, but it was because all the neighbors were doing it. Would they do it if suddenly their neighbors were non-Jews or non-Jewish observant Jews, and so on? It never came through. He saw the problem coming long before it actually struck. So he called them immediately for some educational, religious, cultural work to internalize the tradition, to articulate its values, so that when people kept the observance, they would understand why, what is the higher purpose, what's the deeper power behind it, and therefore they would be able to exercise or to choose to exercise in the presence of choice. His second critique was that it was approaching what we would today call legalism. In other words, people were very careful to follow the exact rules. Sometimes they were totally immersed in the little minutiae of the rules, but they didn't understand the values behind it, and therefore they did not necessarily know how to apply it and live it properly. The classic case, by the way, the case which made his reputation and really his standing for a lifetime, was that, as I mentioned, he went to Vilna to become head of a yeshiva, It turned out that his co-head of the yeshiva was not as charismatic, not as effective a teacher as he was. And so within a short time, the students flocked to Rosh Yeshiva, the head man, felt very upset, very slighted, very pushed aside. And of course, he said so privately to his helpers, to his associates, to the Balabatim who had originally chosen him. When Rabbi Israel got wind that his performance and his leadership and his teaching was hurting, undermining, not deliberately, not consciously, his fellow Rosh Yeshiva, he decided that he didn't want to be someone who hurt or destroyed the career of somebody else. And so he resigned from the heading of the yeshiva. By this time, this has been 2 years of arrival, a number of important leadership balabatim decided this man is too good to let him go. And so they created a kind of a special house where he would teach. It was not called the yeshiva, but it was a place where people came to study, both lay people, mature adults, as well as potential students. And so he served in that role from roughly 1842 till 1849. In 1848, Vilna was struck by a horrific plague. It was called cholera, a highly contagious disease, which causes fever, vomiting, dehydration, and in fact, in its final stages, it causes so much loss of fluid and dehydration and vomiting that the people literally died of dehydration. And it was a plague that swept Europe over the centuries. Here it came back in Eastern Europe and in Vilna in horrific numbers. Now, not the secret, the danger in this, of course, is that people become so sick they can't help themselves. They run out of food or water and they don't feed themselves. Salanter saw the plague coming. And of course, the doctors told him not only was it important that people be helped and served so that not abandoned, because they're abandoned, they die, but also they said to him that people have to learn not to congregate for long hours in closed spaces because it's highly contagious. People had to learn, as it were, to force themselves to be sure to get out in fresh air, to get away from highly concentrated populations, and of course, above all, to keep themselves and their family hydrated and fed properly, because if they survived the fever and the crisis, they would live on. But if not, typically the victims fell because of the last phase of dehydration and loss of food and loss of capacity to function. That's when they died. When the cholera hit in Vilna, Salanter went around from his yeshiva to other yeshivas and recruited a group of yeshiva students, saying to them, Pikuach Nefesh is the highest value in Jewish tradition, saving lives, and that it would be tremendously important if they would serve as a corps that would literally go from house to house, monitor day by day and house by house who is sick, and make sure that they brought them food, water, made sure they were taken care of, and the medical help where that was still available, so that it would really reduce the death rate. And he did this. He organized the yeshiva students, a kind of a Peace Corps, medical corps, and they were functioning through this epidemic. Now, every Friday, he would call the group together. Why? Because Shabbos was coming. And you would take care of the patients. You had to do all kinds of malachot on Shabbat. You had to heat water, give them tea or soup or whatever they needed for their liquid ingestion. You had to prepare or bring medicines. You had to do things which are theoretically Chilul Shabbat, but as you all know, Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbat. But here Salanter realized the problem I mentioned before. For many people, and for the yeshiva students even, they were trained and obedient never to do these kind of malachot on Shabbat. So psychologically, they were not prepared or they had inner hesitation or resistance to cook water on Shabbat, to carry in the public, to fix medicines, all these things that appear to them to be violations of the laws of Shabbat. They understood from him they're supposed to do it, but there was a kind of an inner turmoil resistance, and he was particularly concerned that they might hesitate. So every Friday afternoon, he would call the group together and give them a special shiur on the laws of Shabbat, but also on the importance of Pikuach Nefesh. There's a very famous Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, which talk about this with exactly this point. The danger that people think that these malachot that they're doing are single, quote, violations of Shabbat. They are not. Rambam says, Duchuya, as if Shabbat is put aside. When it's a Pikuach Nefesh case, it is not operating. It's not that you're overruling or overriding the laws of Shabbat. What you are doing is, Shabbat is, as it were, pushed aside by the law of Pikuach Nefesh, and you're doing malachot that are, of course, the highest fulfillment of saving life. So he did this, and again, what fascinates me, and they repeat the story, so the boys mostly followed him, and he was able to succeed. Rambam, in his treatment of this case, warns people that if the hesitation, in fact, he says it should not be done by people who have lower levels of obligation for Shabbat. Don't do it through children. Don't do it through Gentiles. Don't do it through women. That was part of their conception of who had lesser obligation. Do it through Chachmei v'Gedolei Yisrael. The more elevated your learning, the higher the rank religiously, the more you are obligated to fulfill Pikuach Nefesh and should be doing it as a role model. That wasn't, however, the way most of the people saw it. And again, that's his point, that you have obedience and ritual really deeply internalized and regulated, but it doesn't understand the values, and it's a conformist and conventional fulfillment, and therefore it is shocked or unable to function in these malachot. In fact, there's another story that's told about him, that one week, a leading layperson, an important Av Besdin in Vilna, came to him and said to him, he said, I know you mean well, I know you're doing good things, but my son is in that Peace Corps. And this past Shabbos, in treating with his patients, he had to do all kinds of malachot. And he did them. You told him to do them, he did them. But he came home, he was really deeply troubled, I would say almost shattered, that he look at all these acts of Chilul Shabbat. How can you do this, he says, Salanter? How can you take my pure son and yeshiva students who have such genuine religious commitments and disturb or undermine their behavior? Salanter said to him, you've got this all wrong. You've got this all wrong. I gave your son and these yeshivas a chance to do the highest will, the most desired thing God wants, to save a life that overrides or puts aside this mitzvah. So if your son was troubled, and I certainly will speak to him and follow it up, but I want you to understand it's because he, or maybe you, didn't understand what are Hashem's priorities and what is the true religious calling. The true religious calling is not the details of Shabbat observance. That's in the service of life itself. That's in the service of doing God's will by caring for, by nurturing, and by saving the life of God's creatures. It turned out, of course, that this president was not alone in this. Rather, even among the religious leadership, there was this kind of quasi-queasy feeling. Well, what happened is, in the summer, the cholera continued to spread. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur was coming. And Salanter looked around and saw that, in fact, many people would want to fast on Yom Kippur, of course. But when he talked to the doctor said to him, this is raging so out of control that in our judgment, people should not fast. fasting, skipping meals, makes them more vulnerable to coming down with the disease. They should not fast because this fast will weaken and endanger their lives. Secondly, they should spend a lot less hours in Yom Kippur saying all the tefillot and the piyutim and so on, because they should not be in a crowded place next to each other with highly contagious germs circulating. They should cut the tefillot short. They should spend as less time as possible in the Beit HaKnesset. And with the time they don't pray, they should be outside in the fresh air, away from each other and breathing the fresh air, which is a much safer practice. Salanter understood this, and he began to speak to some of the other Gedolim and the heads of the religious community of the establishment in Vilna. And most of them said to him, you're right. We have to make sure this is done, but what can you do? Can you tell people not to eat? You tell people to eat on Yom Kippur? Is that what you're telling us to do? So when people came to a dayan or to the other important rabbis and asked the shaila, they said, should I fast or not? The answer they would give them privately is it's so dangerous that the doctors say you shouldn't do it. But they would do that privately. They refused to publicly announce this is the psak. And of course, Salanter said to them, but you know what that means? That means the people who don't have enough initiative or courage to ask a shaila, they will endanger their lives. We know what this means by not publicizing it. A lot of people, out of genuine but mistaken traditional feelings, will feel obligated to fast no matter what. Didn't help. Came Rosh Hashanah, up to Rosh Hashanah, he spoke to them and he kept waiting. He was hoping that someone, perhaps the Beit Din, perhaps the leadership, would post a notice saying just what I just told you, that although it's a generalization, you want to check with your doctor or your rabbi if you hesitate, but by the instruction of the doctors, which in a time of plague is the overriding authority by the Torah standards. Pikuach nefesh comes first. Fasting in this year is not the right thing to do. No one posted, no one announced, although privately they were much more they were doing this. Rosh Hashanah came and he saw that no one has posted. So on that day, which was the last week before Yom Kippur, he printed and posted notices throughout Vilna, explaining the doctor's ruling and explaining why people should eat on Yom Kippur, suggesting and fresh air and cutting tefillot and so on. He posted these notices throughout Vilna. Well, of course, they caused a great sensation for obvious reasons. And a lot of people began to criticize and complain. Who is this man? He's not an official rabbi. He's not the head of the Beit Din. He's not. Who is he to tell us? And it's a scandal to publicly post that people should eat on Yom Kippur. Anyway, Salanter did not directly refute or defend himself. He gave a major shiur on Shabbat Shuvah to show his lumdus that, in effect, he's not making this up, that he is an authority to be respected. And he stuck to his guns. On Yom Kippur itself, he came to the great synagogue. This is a famous incident, and there's some arguments about the details I'm about to tell you. Because many, if not most of the people in that shul were fasting. Because again, the power of tradition and the Yom Kippur, particularly, people have a kind of a fear. And how can you not fast on Yom Kippur? He got up at the great synagogue and he explained again that halachically, pikuach nefesh is doche, that the doctors are the ones who have concluded that this is not responsible and it's dangerous. And therefore, the Torah is commanding us to eat and to drink, most important, to drink on this day in order to preserve our lives. And he called in the shamash who brought in cake, breakfast food and wine and water, and told the congregation to come up to break the fast in order to be able to keep this Yom Kippur. Well, it caused, of course, a huge sensation. As I said, such a sensation that later literature, there's an argument. Some people, well, he didn't go that far. He did say they should break the fast, and some people said that he encouraged people to go out and get food. Other reports insist, well, he didn't really break the fast. He said go out and eat shiur, eat small pieces a little bit at a time, so it's less than a shiur, the actual minimum requirement to violate the law. My own judgment, my own belief, and actually it's a very famous story in Haskalic Hebrew literature, Shlosha Shachlu 308, which tells this story with great elaboration. And my point of the story is that Salanter did what the Gedolim should have done but didn't do, because why? Because as a great rabbi who wants to go down in Jewish history, this is the great rabbi who told people to eat on Yom Kippur. So in effect, out of self-protection, out of a kind of defensiveness for one's own reputation, in effect, they were prepared not to say anything publicly, which I'm translating as Salanter did, meaning risk lives, cause deaths, even if they were not intentional, in order to protect your own reputation as a pious and observant human being. But to Salanter, this was the decisive proof that they didn't understand the Torah's value system or its priority. Third major criticism of Orthodoxy as it was there was that it was quite strong on rituals, but quite, as it were, weak, or at least a lesser caliber on religious ethical responsibilities, or what we now call ben Adam lachavero. In his Igeret Musar, he wrote a letter called Igeret Musar, the letter of Musar, calling upon the people to create a Musar training, Musar study program for the lay people, was his original dream. He writes the following, and if you can show this on the screen, he writes as follows. It's a whole long letter. The letter starts with the paradox, which animates his thought, and we'll come back to in a minute. The paradox is the human being is a deeply emotional person, and his emotions drive him, and his emotions, many times, they are instincts, they are lustful, they don't necessarily follow the Torah's desire or guidelines, whereas the human being also has reason, has a mind, and the Torah appeals to the human being to use his or her reason to control the appetites, to control the emotions and instincts, and to do the right thing, and to do the mitzvot as commanded. So every human being, in a sense, is a scene of a constant battle and is torn between emotion and instinct, which many times say, do anything you want to. Please come back to that first page. I'm speaking of page 269, 369 and 371. He writes as follows in his letter. In our locales place God, the prohibitions against eating carcasses, improperly slaughtered animals, meaning treif, and the like, non-kosher foods, are deeply rooted in the Jewish soul. That's our accomplishment, to the point that no one needs to force his nature or appetite to distance from these things. They are repulsive to him. It's emotionally, we're so conditioned by now that the idea of eating something treif is repulsive. It would not occur, God forbid, to any seller of kosher meat, to the butchers, to fail to consult the rabbinic authority when there is a shaila, when there's a question mark. Because again, you don't want to take a chance. When he finds something in the internal organs that he suspects renders the meat treif, he will check immediately, although this sometimes might cause him a substantial financial loss. The fear of heaven is upon him, both in his nature and habit. Wickedness, causing Jews to stumble, is unthinkable to him, which is a great accomplishment. But, however, due to our many sins, in business matters, in business ethics, in shopkeeping, in banking and loaning, the situation is just the opposite. Most people will not inquire on their own about suspected theft, potential gezel, or exploitation, unless and until they are sued by another. Some of them, and even after suit is brought, will resort to deceitful strategies, swindling, lying, denial, or will brazenly deny. Yet the Torah, also in the Torah, all such sins are equal. The same Torah that says, be careful not to eat treif of food, the same Torah says not to steal, not to cheat, not to take advantage, not to exploit, right? So both sins are equal. Both forbidden foods and stealing are prohibitions subject to the Torah and its laws, right? You must not eat meat torn by beasts in the field, meaning non-kosher meat, right? And you shall not eat any nevela carcass. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not steal, and the like. They're both identical. So just as has been implanted in the Jewish soul that all forms of treif are the same to him, and whatever the rabbi decides is non-kosher is repulsive to him, and he will act as instructed, so in the ideal world properly, with regard to money, whatever, according to the Torah, belongs to his fellow is stolen, and in violation you shall not steal if you take it, right? Yet we see that due to our many sins, even students of Torah, and nearly even those who fear God, people who are looked up to as Yirei Shamayim and as religious models, are not properly careful about this prohibition, which is not atoned for Yom Kippur. It's a much more serious thing than Yom Kippur, than treif, because stealing, you are not forgiven by Yom Kippur or even by death. As you know, you have to do tshuva, you have to return the money, and so on. And so Salanter says, in effect, this is a general problem in our traditional community. We have established a very high expectation standard of what we consider Yirat Shamayim, which is ritual performance accurately. But in a sense, we have downsized or downgraded the ethical responsibilities, which in fact are more serious and more severe. Wonderful he's known for his pithy sayings. Salanter once said, it's a play on a daily prayer we say in a saying when we say Tachanun in the weekday services. It says, it opens with a quote from David HaMelech. When he's given a choice by the prophet between he has made an illegal or improper census, and God is about to punish him. He gives him a choice: shall you be punished by an enemy invasion, or shall you be punished by a plague sent by God? Says David, let me fall into God's hands, because God has mercy and God is kind, and not fall into human hands. In other words, I'll take the punishment of a plague from God rather than a human enemy, because humans are harsher and crueler. Salanter makes a play on this, says as follows: Nipla, if I am about to fall into sin, no, please, B'yad Hashem Apola. When it comes to sins against God, that's where I should fall and fail. Ki Rabim Rachamav, because our God is merciful and loving and kind and will forgive. Uviyad Adam, when it comes to sins against fellow human beings, Allah Pola, may I not fall, may I not give in to temptation. Because the human being suffers in a way. When I don't keep Shabbos or eat treif, God doesn't suffer. God may be displeased, but doesn't suffer. But when I steal, when I harm, when I ruin the reputation, the human being steals, suffer. The human stolen from suffers. So Salanter, in effect, the pun being that, of course, all commandments are equally binding according to him. But if I'm going to be sloppy or fail or fall, let it be in those commandments which are between human beings, but we have raised a traditional community, he said, unfortunately, which has achieved the reverse. It has communicated absolute fidelity and obedience in ritual, but a rather weak standard in allowing oneself to cheat or take advantage of the other person. So his critique of Orthodoxy then means that we have to reconsider or revision what our priorities are. And Salanter's suggestion starts with this. The real goal of the Torah is not to raise a generation that keeps 613 or whatever detailed mitzvot you want to talk about, detail by detail. Those are steps, those are practices that make possible a religious life. But the real and central goal of the Torah, it's a little quib, he says, the Torah came to make a mensch. That's what the Torah is about. It wants to raise a human being who is not just afraid of God or medactic and careful in ritual. It's somebody who respects life, who respects their fellow human beings, who has the character of kindness and caring and respect for the others. So if you had to summarize the whole Torah, it came to make a mention. All these observances are meant to train you. All these commands are meant to guide you to be a mensch. Therefore, if you want to raise or you want to be yourself a religious person, the place to start is to focus on yourself, on your character, on your behavior patterns, on what he calls your midot, your personal qualities. You have to stop and do an analysis and work on that. And in fact, although the ideal of learning Torah as the highest value had become triumphant in the so-called Litvak culture, Salanter's point is that we have, in a sense, a greater responsibility, and that is to perfect our characters. The Torah wants us to curb and untrain our anger. Torah wants us to reduce envy and jealousy and sniping at other people because we're envious and jealous of them. The Torah wants us to develop a sense of what's right and what's wrong to the point of willingness to not get money by taking advantage or by cheating or by overcharging and these kinds of things. So Musar is his solution. We have to, in addition to learning Gemara and learning, that was the dominant subject of the both lay and yeshiva education, we have to set aside time for the Musar literature. The Musar literature has a tradition going back to, I guess, the book of Proverbs, telling you the right behavior, the right attitudes. But he himself tried to develop Musar in even a more conscious and active way. To him, it meant analyzing your character, self-study, self-critique, and self-improvement. And so he said, and this is the next passage I want to call your attention to, that Musar study is something which many great scholars said isn't necessary. They want to just learn Gemara. When one of his main disciples went to Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, the greatest figure perhaps in the Misnagdic tradition, and said, we would like you to introduce Musar, study of ethics and character development, into yeshiva. Rabbi Chaim said, never mind. You know what he said to him? Musar is like castor oil. People used to take castor oil for their stomach, if the stomach upsets. He said, for sick people, if you take castor oil, you need to, and it's good for you. But for non-sick people, take castor oil, it's repulsive, you vomit, you discomfort. He said, Musar is like castor oil, so go and bring it to the people who are sick and need it. My students don't need it. If they want to improve their character, I will give them a shir, he said, on Shor Shanogach Sapora. This is a famous passage in Baba Kama, the ox that gores a cow. Well, of course, it doesn't seem on the surface to have any intellectual, ethical focus, but so what I was trying to say was just learn Torah. Don't need specialized Musar study. It's a waste of time, and you could spend that time learning Gemara. Well, of course, I must say, I think Salanter was right, but Salanter's comeback was just the opposite. And here's what he says again in this letter to his students. This is page 19, if you look at the second major paragraph. He starts by saying, with learning Torah is, of course, the highest value, but all kinds of people under all kinds of circumstances are exempt, right? On line 4, in the first paragraph, women are exempt from study of Torah, as you may know, until the 20th century, until Rav David Silber, a great pioneer in bringing advanced rabbinic learning and Torah study to women. the truth was they were generally considered exempt and not treated such right. So he lists all the people who are exempt. If they're sick, if they're destitute. Then here's the second paragraph. Not so this Musar study. This study is required obligation for everyone. No one is excused. In other words, paradoxically, you who said Musar is less important, I'm saying it's more important because nobody's excused. Now, he never could bring himself to challenge the promise of learning Torah. No one would listen to him, they would dismiss him. But what he's trying to say is that Musar is much heavier weight, much more important than you are used to. Proof, everybody's required Musar, whereas Torah study, there are exemptions under various circumstances. There is a battle between, there's a battle hanging over all intelligent beings. It's the battle with the evil urge and its strategies that lead people into wrong behavior. So the answer is, of course, that you have to battle that, and that needs focus and particular work on ethics and character. Of course, it says later on, in an instant, a person will sin without limit because emotions and instincts may drive us to do terrible sins without thinking, and because we're carried, he will carry out every evil and depraved project in broad daylight because it's shameless and it drives us to act. So we have to strengthen ourselves, and we have to stand up to this tremendous battle by the study of Musar. What did he come up with as particularly study of Musar? Well, of course, I have to start by saying he tried to reach out to all people, as you heard here, but he particularly hoped to reach the lay people. Because again, I told you, he saw modernity coming, that there would be choices, and we'd have to develop an internalized religion to resist and to make the right choices. He saw in the same way, when the culture changes and modernity is here, the masses who are now simply observant and obedient and conformist to what the tradition is asking will have choices, will have multiple views, will have people who go the other way. And therefore, again, you need to work at this now, and you need to work to the lay people because they are the influences, they are the coming businessmen, they are the coming activists in the modern Haskalah developments, and it's they who we have to train and inspire to carry on the tradition which they will do more likely in a higher, more ethical, more responsible way. So what did he propose? He proposed that they start with lay people, but of course, as it turned out, it's a higher standard and a demand standard. In the end, he succeeded mostly at yeshiva people, and with yeshiva, students took over or created. But he proposed set aside specific, extended, significant periods for study of the Musa literature. Secondly, set aside time to work on self-critique and self-analysis. They introduced the idea of a mashgiach, of a supervisor inside the yeshiva, whose job was not to teach Talmud, but to work and to follow and monitor each student, identify their character issues and traits that have to be improved, help them diagnose their self-needs, help them find ways and methods and work to improve their own character. Thirdly, he created this idea of a Beis HaMusar. He said, the maximum emotional impact of Musar would be to actually set aside, he created this idea in his communities. There'd be a house, like a beit, he calls it a basement, like people go to a base medrash to be inspired to learn. People would go to the Beis HaMusar to be inspired to study Musar. They would meet common souls, spirits who also want to study Musar, and that will make them more likely to engage with Chavrusa in this kind of study. So he created the Beis HaMusar and told his students to go there regularly and to encourage lay people to go there regularly. And he suggested locate it near the base medrash so that people will find it easy to go from the base medrash to here, because otherwise people are going to say, well, I have to go to the base medrash because Torah learning is the most important thing, and they won't get to the Musar place. Another example of his creativity, he suggested creating vads, individual committees. So it's not just self-analysis. Let's say I work with 3 or 4 or 5 people together. So I do my analysis, but the group is part of it. And the group helps me by offering their critique, saying, well, you saw this thing about yourself. You didn't notice this. Or I saw last week or this past time you did this X and Y and Z. So the group, the VAD, the committee, helps me with a deeper self-critique and with suggested help and correction and reinforcement. Once I do that, the committee, the group, honors me and celebrates it and gives me incentive to go further. Last example, he suggested that the study of Musa should not just be intellectual. People should set aside time to learn what he called hispilus, hitpa'alut. Hispilus is what? Don't just say it intellectually. Don't just study a text. Turn it into a powerful, emotional, driving experience. By the way, this is my experience in this book that referred to the book Israel just published. We have at the beginning, each of the co-authors and co-translators tells his own personal experience. I ended up studying for smicha and for my college years for Yisrael, contrary to my original idea that I would go to a modern Orthodox school for my training, because I came into the base medrash to see what it was like. It turned out it was at nighttime, just before Ma'ariv, when they learned Hispilus. And each student picks a text. I was sitting there, actually my father came with me to see what the yeshiva was like. I was sitting there learning Gemara, and suddenly the place falls silent because it's 15 minutes before Ma'ariv, time to learn Hispilus. And while I'm sitting there looking around, at the table opposite from me, the young man who was learning actively jumps up and begins to sing and chant. Hakina, hataiva, v'akavod, jealousy, envy, lust, searching for honor, motziin is remove you from this world, they destroy your life. He said it aloud, and for the next 15 minutes, he chanted it, he danced it, he cried it. That's just one person. And suddenly the whole base medrash exploded. Some had his text, many had other texts. And so for the next 15 minutes, I was in a storm of do not steal, honor people, stop the evil urge. People were chanting and singing, and it was mind-blowing. I didn't know quite what it was, but I said, I want to go here and see more of it. So these were examples of how Salanter developed the idea of Musar and convinced students in the yeshiva to take it on. Now, the other major point I want to make about his career and about his approach to life itself, aside from the central point of developing an internalized religion that's focused on God and therefore understands that service of God is the highest value, and service of God in saving a life is a higher value than service of God in saying a tefillah or for that matter, following a detailed observance schedule of Shabbat itself. The other major point he tried to bring out, and as part of his discovery, was the human being has this incredible combination I mentioned before of emotion, instinct driving him, and of intellectual reason. And that this is the paradox. In order to keep the Torah, you must be guided by reason, which tells you this is right and this is wrong. But in order to be a human being, you also have to deal with and express and control or channel your emotions, which can easily lead you to do the wrong because it's more tempting or more available or more in your eyes at this moment. So Salanter comes up with the idea that in working on yourself, there are two major ways of dealing with the temptation to do the wrong thing. One of them he calls kivush hayetzer, conquering the urge, which we would in contemporary language call repression. You understand, you would like to simply take advantage of the sexual availability of this person, although it's improper. You would like to take advantage that you could cheat and get away with cheating on your taxes, even though the Torah tells you you have to be honest and faithful in business, etc., etc. So what you need is your reason, and first of all, study the laws, and says, this is wrong, and this is wrong behavior, and this is stealing. Secondly, you have to study these laws that tell you, resist the temptation. And if you work on it, you develop the capacity to repress bad urges. You understand that you will be tempted to these things, but your emotion is not controlling you. Your reason is controlling. It's what we would today call repression. There's a second method, which in a way, particularly in your youth, is a more functional and more effective way. It's the way of what we would call sublimation. Channel your desire for recognition into rechannel toward getting gratification out of helping people, or out of teaching, or out of a constructive use of the same desire for recognition and appreciation from others. Channel your lust for life experiences and move them from what is tempting to what is right and what is constructive, and so on and so forth. So here's his language. Here is his language in letter 30, in which he has an extended analysis of the two methods of correcting character. When a person, this is the second paragraph, when a person is this is page 267. When a person is in the mode of repressing his character traits and psychological drive, he should be repressed by his reason. He is called one who therefore serves God with his Yetzer Tov, that is to say, his reason, which controls him and makes him do the right thing. And when he sublimates his character traits and psychological drives, when he turns them to the point where the same drives can be directed toward what God asks of him, he is called one who serves God with his Yetzer Hara. That is to say, the psychological drives, whose essence is disposed toward evil, but he learned to sublimate, to sweetening their bitterness and changing them to good. So that's with both yours, famous medrash, double bays, says the Gemara, with both your urges. So it is admirable, it's necessary sometimes, and it's a good level if you can learn to use your reason to control your behavior and make sure it's good behavior. But it's an even greater accomplishment if you can take some of those very drives that led you to hurt or to criticize or to embitter or to hurt other people and direct them into praise and into building and into strengthening other people, because that way you're serving God with both your urges, the good urge and the bad urge, the reason and the emotions together toward a higher level. And again, I don't have time to read the whole letter. He tries to then describe the advantages of each method. And in general, he says, in your youth, your younger years, when the juices are flowing and when the instincts are strongest, it's wise to try sublimation, because when you try simple repression, in many cases they break out, they rebel, they break out of the controls, and they do the wrong thing anyway. Whereas in sublimation, you take the force and the power, and instead of opposing them, you divert them for good. In any event, my point is that he brings this other dimension, which is the discovery of the unconscious and the emotional drives in people, how powerful they are. One of the strengths of the Litvak tradition, you study the text says, thou shalt not steal, and it's okay. That's what God is asking. The strength of Salanter's point was that you were dealing with emotions, and it will, if you don't deal with the emotions, you have a double danger. Not only do they break out and you do the wrong thing, worse, he said the emotions, it's the unconscious level. They distort your reasoning. You convince yourself that this is really a good thing to do, even though it's bad. You subvert the Torah's message. And this is possible in the greatest of scholars as it is in the everyday person. To convince yourself that what you want to do for wrong reasons, illicit, for emotional instinctual drives, is the right thing to do. You do the wrong side. He once had a very witty but powerful line. He said, I've met people who are a tzaddik, a gadol, a great scholar, a chacham, wise in the ways of Torah, and a believer who in that same moment are a Rasha, they're wicked, they're harmful of people. And this is the paradox, because if you don't have a self-analysis, if you're not aware of your own drives, reason may easily be overridden, or even worse, subverted to the wrong conclusions. And he writes in another letter, the Torah was given by God to humans. God understood that we have these mixed emotions and instincts and drives, and that we might misread or might misapply the Torah. He said, God accepts our human frailty, but he asks us to use our minds, to use our educational capacities to minimize the distortion and to maximize the honesty and integrity of our response. And that's why Mussar is so important, that even the great scholars need help in clarifying and purifying and filtering their emotions so that their reason will operate properly and their understanding of Torah will lead us the right direction. One last comment, and then throw it open to your questions, of course, and that is Salanter understood not only that we have to refocus Torah and the vision of religion in this primary way of focusing on human development and character developments, so that all the observances confirm, strengthen, and uplift our character, rather than they become ritual, empty actions that in some cases turn negative, either by misapplication or by simply the instincts running away and the desire for self-advantage to take advantage and violate the Torah's rules. But beyond that, he said one other major transformation, that Orthodoxy would have to develop institutions that understand the change in the economy that's coming. He said up to now, people became Gedolim, became great scholars, because from childhood on, their parents and the community treasured and honored learning and religious leadership. So people wanted to achieve those high levels of recognition and support and understanding. He said now in the new culture, a lot of that authority will be undermined, and there'll be alternative, attractive. So it's important now to create institutions that will support people who want to go on to great learning and scholarship, but we can no longer depend that their parents, that their community, their family will tell them, we'll support you anything, because this is the highest value. So he came up with, Rabbi Israel Salanter was his colleague, co-creator. They created what is today known as the Kollel, an institution to which students of high talent or potential high development into great scholars would go, because the Kollel would give them support, would give them special training and special attention, and financial guarantees. Many times as you get older, they have family, they have children. Someone has to take care of them. But the old pattern in which the family would make them, my wife, Blue's family, there were 6 brothers and they had a family business. The 5 brothers ran the business. The 6th brother, who nafshi choshka Torah, he wanted to learn Torah. So they sent him to Mir in Europe, and then from there he went to Israel when the Holocaust came to study, and he was a share in the business that took him financially. But for the vast majority of Torah scholars, that wasn't available anymore starting in the late 19th century. So Salanter's solution was a kollel. Another example, to reorganize the yeshiva, to give exams, to take attendance records, and so on, because he said, in all honesty, the yeshivas that exist, they're great learning, but they are also not well organized. They were pre-modern. And therefore, students need and they perform better when there are rules and disciplines and monitoring. So Salanter, in effect, suggested we have to have institutional developments. One final point about institutional developments. In the last 20 years of his life, he came to realize that Eastern Europe was resisting his message. His students succeeded in certain limited yeshiva. He reached certainly high-level students, but the masses were not open and not following Mussar because they were habitual and stuck in their routines as religious Jews, and not so responsive. The last 20 years of his life, he spent most of his time in Western Europe. And he was asked, "What are you doing there?" And he said, "You know what? In Eastern Europe, we're on the top of a hill, and our horses are about to run away. You can't get control of those horses right now. They're not going to listen to your reason. You're not going to be able to stop them." In Western Europe, the modern has come already. The horses ran away. There's a lot of erosion of support. But they've run so much into the valley now that if you can step in and take charge, you can get control of the horses and redirect the horse and carriage. In short, he said, the Jewish tradition is fighting for its life. And in modernity, a lot of Jews are going to fall by the wayside. In Western Europe, let's see what techniques we can develop to strengthen commitment and to regain control of the direction. I'll give you an example. He went to the West, came up with the idea of introducing Talmud to university study. In Eastern Europe, university study was usher to this day in the Haredi community. You're not allowed to go. He came up with the idea of bringing Talmud into the curriculum of the university. Why? He said, because the Jewish students who go to university, and more were going, they see at the university level, there's no representation of Torah or of Talmud. Now, if they would see it as a course, which is respected and studied like the great Greek classics or the great humanities, it's a chance to have access to Torah learning in their situation and to exposure to the tradition in a positive way in their condition. He came up with the idea of forming groups around the university, what we would today call Hillel, which would give them social and Jewish programming in order to strengthen the Jewish commitments. What happened in his lifetime was most of the people who went to university broke with the religion, in many cases completely separated, and in many cases even converted out of the community. So again, Salanter's point was we have to learn the great challenges and raise the level. He created a magazine called Tavuna, which is printed in our book, in which he tried to get the rabbis of his time to write for a popular audience. There were shadows and shuvas around, but they were read hard to read, and they were read mostly by other great scholars. The average person didn't know what you're talking about. He argued that we should create a journal in which we talk simple, clear, lay language about the religion, about the observance, about the values, and why they should keep them, so that people can be helped at their level to internalize and understand the tradition. So the honest answer is he was a partial success, and as I said, he reached many yeshiva advanced students, and they built yeshiva for a period of some 20, 30 years. Many yeshiva introduced Musar as a major study zone. But he never got to reach the lay people because Eastern Europe wasn't ripe and ready for it. And he had much resistance from the establishment by who wants to waste time on Musar? We should be spending our time on learning Talmud. So in some ways, his life is a failure, but I'd say in some ways, his life is extremely instructive for our time because it turned out he was right. Modernity was not going to be stoppable, not going to be escaped from by closing out the door and going into a ghetto, although I admit significant numbers of Jews have done that. And so the task of integrating remains, and the vision that the most successful form of religious adaptation to the new culture would be to raise a person of strong values, strong internalized relationship to Hashem, in which he understands that all religious activity is service of God and help and concern for fellow human beings, and not some external obedience system. And of course, his teaching that in the end, the measure of our success is to raise people who are mentioned, who embrace all of life and live by the Torah's ethics out of a deep sense of respect for God and for humanity. So that's my presentation of the revisioning of Orthodoxy by Rabbi Israel. Now, I'll be happy to get your questions or responses.
All right. I just have a few questions that came up in chat that I'm going to get to first, and then we can open it up to the crowd. Just first, earlier from Bernard Kabak, quote, regarding the controversy over not fasting on Yom Kippur, Rav Greenberg said that the leading rabbis, for their own reasons, did not come out and endorse Rav Salanter's position. Were there leading rabbis who affirmatively opposed Salanter's position? Bernard, can you just clarify that?
Good question. And in the literature I don't read of. There must have been. I hope there were. It's a great question, but I honestly have never seen in any of the writing some discussion of how many rabbis agreed with him. I guess I never thought of asking the question in part because one of Salanter's great qualities was a very strong character. He was, in fact, it's one of the part of the Musa training. They train you not to depend on the public applause or public criticism. That you matter how the trend is, that shouldn't affect you. You should focus in on the principle and the right thing to do and do it. And we used to have in Beis Yosef, they had exercises literally where you would sit with the group, and the group, it was a stage thing, but they would say something, and they in advance, you didn't know this, they all agreed to say something. There's a famous experiment in American university. They take two strands of rope, one is shorter and one is longer, and to fix. There are 5 people. The first 4 are fixed to say that the shorter one is longer. And the one who is the subject doesn't know that. So when they say which is longer, how long does it take the first to be longer than the second, or properly, so that he will stand up for that, even though the rest are saying no? You know what the answer is? It had to be 2 times longer or more before a majority of the respondents would say, those 4 guys are wrong. This is the shortest stick, or this is the longest stick. So Rabbi Israel trained. So I never thought to ask, did he get support? I guess he never asked. I hope there was some, but I honestly don't know.
All right. Another question asks, I see Sandra Lilienthal has a hand up. Sandra, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Rav Yitz. It's always a pleasure and an honor to learn from you again. I think Tanakh is pretty clear on the importance of character development. We have the famous Isaiah passage, is this the fast I require? And there are many others. So my question to you is, when did we lose this notion of character development and began to focus so strongly on the details of ritual observance? And why do you think this happened?
Again, it's a fair and honest question. My personal guess is the ghettoization process is what pushed this. In other words, as the community, we were treated as pariahs, we were treated as outsiders. And as the community was pushed into the ghetto, literally, as we know in the Middle Ages, what happens is you lose contact with the Gentiles. So the first victim of that, of course, is you were suffering and denied your rights and locked in at night and so on. But what you lose is a sense of the humanity of the Gentiles, and the sense of ethical responsibility to other human beings is weakened. And then when you're inside the ghetto and there's no other view or religious teaching around you, again, what happens is it becomes routinized. One of the great themes in Salanter's work is to fight routine, because he says what routine is a kind of a death, a mini death of the soul. Because when you do things completely routinely, you don't know what you're doing. It's as if you're dead. You're not doing anything conscious, anything willing, anything meaningful. So I think the second factor was, as it became the only norm available, what happened? So the answer is, everybody's doing it, so I do it too. But at some point, it becomes, I do it without thinking about it. And the point after that is, maybe I do it even if I don't feel like doing it, because everybody else is. Of course, if I wear stockings of 20 denier, I don't know what the exact number is, as against 15, they'll say it's too thin or it's too. So that's what I think it's a process whereby it becomes the only way, but that you lose the whole sense of what you're doing and why you're doing it. That's my best guess. And I think it got worse in the modern period because there were all these outside opportunities. So the only way I could really stay inside, it wasn't legal anymore that you had to be in the ghetto. I mean, in Russia, you did have to stay in the ghetto, but in Western Europe. So if you stayed in the ghetto, you were very conscious of those choices, and maybe you missed them or were tempted by them. So you end up in stronger denial and in deeper insistence upon conformity. That's the phenomenon we see in Israel also today. So I'm guessing that's the way it went, but I, again, will say I haven't done a scientific or broad study of that question in detail, when exactly it happened. But let me finish by quoting Yaakov Katz, the great Jewish historian, who said people particularly Haredi Orthodoxy, its claim is to be, this is the original all the way back. He said Haredi Orthodoxy is as much a product of modern culture as the tradition is. It's more so, because the tradition was a tradition and it was subject to change. It was subject to development in a natural way. And it was subject to people being aware. When it becomes defensive, ghettoized, and shut in, then it closes out and becomes much more conformist. As Katz points this out, the famous line from Chassam Sofer, one of the great founders of Orthodoxy in the modern period, of Haredi Orthodoxy, he said, it's a pun again, Chodesh Osir Torah, the new crop every season in the spring is not edible, it's not kosher until you bring certain sacrifices, the Omer. So the Gemara's shorthand, Chodesh, the new Tvua, is Osir, is prohibited by the Torah until you get to it. So they turned it into a slogan, Chodesh, anything new is Osir from the Torah. When Chassam Sofer was asked, can you give a sermon in the language of the country so people understand, right? When he was asked whether you can say a prayer in English or in his country, in Czech or in German, he said no. So they said, but look, here's Yom Kippur, here's Kaddish, we have a tradition. He said, yes, but that was in the old days. Now we're under siege. Now they're trying to change the religion, reform it. So you can't permit any deviation. We need absolute and total conformity, because any deviation is a slippery slope down to the bitter end.
I think we have time for one more question. As I don't see anything in chat, but I do see,
Yeah.
you see Debbie with a hand up.
Yes. Is there a connection between Rabbi Israel Salanter and Benjamin Franklin?
There is, by the way. I'm assuming you're referring to something specifically. Salanter, is part of the religious training development program, took a book by a man named Mendel Laffin. He was actually a Ish of the Haskalah. So he was a traditional observant Jew, but he was kind of a moderate Haskalah member and who felt there's room for improvement and change and improvement in Jewish education and so on. Laffin wrote a book called Cheshbon HaNefesh, like accounting for the soul. And one of the things he developed was he took 13 qualities of a person you should work on. Calm, no anger, inner tranquility, 13 qualities, kindness, conscious awareness. He laid it out in 13 qualities. You would take each quality one whole week. So 4 times a year, you'd go through each quality and work on it. For that week, you keep a journal. For that week, every time it comes up, were you calm? Were you angry? Did you lose your temper? Did you lose your reason? You write it down and you try to correct it and so on. So Salanter, when he came across this book, he actually got it reprinted and widely distributed because he felt this is a great handbook for Musar. Well, it turned out that Mendel Laffin read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, the great American founding father, and in his autobiography, Salanter had written this idea that he developed of 13 qualities that he worked on, weren't the same as Laffin. So it turned out that Laffin had come across this and plagiarized, that's not a good Musar quality, and put it in this book, and no one knew that. So it turned out Salanter had a connection to Franklin, not that he knew that did, not that anybody knew he did. What strikes me, he reprinted it because it was usable and a very handy handbook, and this is another have to help people develop techniques to self-correct, and this was a great way of doing that. I must say I did it in my days in yeshiva. I even did it for some time after the yeshiva. It can be very effective. You write down every time you slipped into Yoshin Hara, etc., etc., etc. So the point being that it was a very effective technique. And the interesting thing, again, that's the price you pay for ghettoization and denial of modern culture. A good idea that came from the outside culture was pushed aside normally. In this case, because no one knew, it was adapted into the tradition.
He didn't know it came from Benjamin Franklin.
No, he didn't. Salanter didn't know. I
Yeah.
presume that Lapin did know, but he didn't give credit in his book, so no one suspected of borrowing from the Gentiles. Thank you, Debbie.
Ravitz, do you have time for one more question?
Sure, please.
Amy, I think, did you have a question? Amy Fistel, I believe you jumped in for a question. Can you unmute yourself? Amy, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for this talk. When I was in college, I did a paper on Rabbi Salanter and the Musar movement. And then about 20 years ago at our Young Israel, they decided to have a panel discussion for those of us who are in the professional workplace to describe to some high school and college students how you can maintain orthodoxy in the workplace. And it was interesting that most of the people on the panel talked about things like, oh, I carry an extra tuna fish sandwich in my purse so that when we go out to eat, I have what to eat. And some of the men talked about whether or not they could wear a kippah at work, whether it would be distraction or whatever. And I was the only one that said, I'm concerned about the business ethics and treating the clients appropriately and my colleagues appropriately. And it was like nobody else even thought of that. And I was really concerned that, yeah, I guess we're missing the point. It's the trappings of Judaism that were important rather than the ethics.
It's an important point. Again, Salanter certainly was medactic, was very careful and affirmed all the observances and all the rituals. But he, as you just said, he said you have to keep in mind the other ethical requirements. They're in the same Torah, and in fact repeated more often and more regularly, so that it's a kind of selective hearing. It's the wrong kind of hearing. It's the kind of hearing which we saw in the prophets. People would cheat and take advantage of people and do all kinds of wrong things. And then they would bring sacrifices because in a way they were thinking of God transactionally. If I give God the gifts that God wants, if I give God the payoffs that God wants, I can get away with other things. Salanter was talking about a holistic approach to the religion. A holistic approach, I said, is to make a human being who's a mensch. But that mensch may have religious expression and religious rituals as part of their life, their religious life, their emotional life, but no less, and certainly primary in terms of what Salanter said about who gets hurt and who gets helped, is the business ethic. There's no question, even in the modern Orthodox community, it seems to me, there hasn't been enough primacy of getting this point across that you're getting across.
There was a song in the 60s, one of the lines, and it was a protest song, and one of the lines is, hate your next door neighbor, but don't forget to say grace.
Okay, that's a good example. Or again, a Benjamin Franklin line. No, it was not that. There was the governor of Pennsylvania who said to the Quakers were famous in colonial Pennsylvania. They were very sharp businessmen, took advantage, but they were famous for their piety and for their religious devotion. And he said, I see that you pray in church every Sunday and you pray on people the rest of the week. And this is a danger and this is a challenge. And again, I'm not trying to say that everybody who keeps ritual is unethical, but the restoration of the wholeness and the priority, which is God's priority, of care for human beings. This is the measure of religion to this day, and so it's psychological. I try to perceive it when I say who is frum or who is religious. So he keeps Shabbos or he has a longer pair of tzitzis or whatever. It misses the definition. The real definition of who is more religious is someone who keeps the whole Torah and particularly the ethical Torah at the highest level. And we have to train or retrain people to think in those terms. I think that is part of his unfinished legacy. I do want to finish by saying about Salanter, the reason we did this book, and I give Justin Pines, my co-author, great credit, is that he felt that there was a chance in our lifetime to do it again, meaning that people are looking for ways of strengthening their religious and their ethical life. And he was convinced that Salanter's teachings and Salanter's mottos, and for that matter, his educational techniques, really can be adapted for the modern culture. There is a kind of a grassroots Musa learning in different people. It's centralized. There's no one yeshiva. There's no one person. But the idea of now focusing again on character, on ethics, and on a standard of religion that incorporates all of life and not just one set aside sacramental sacred area, but the all of life is sacred. I think that's a worthy challenge and a worthy task for our time. And more important, it makes a religion and people are able to function and to inspire others in this modern culture. I was thinking that I said before about Rav David Silva and his contribution by educating women. Well, that's a good example. 50% of the Jewish community was not being educated, was not giving the highest insight. Think of all the wasted minds and hearts and energy that could have and is now beginning to be applied to teach Torah, to spread Torah, and to serve as ethical models. And women doctors and women lawyers and women politicians and so on can be role models just as influencing for religious purposes as official rabbis or official religious figures. So I think that I not only appreciate the question, I think this is a major opportunity for our lifetime to take the best of our values, to hold them up high, and this will enable us to be present, to be influential, and to be strong in this culture, which gives us many opportunities, but also in many places doesn't look up to us because they don't see the standard that religion means higher standards and higher values and higher ethics. So thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you very much, Yitz. Thanks for coming, teaching us, and you should continue all of your good work. If people want to purchase the book, Or Yisrael, the writings, letters of Israel Salanter, will send that information, and that can be done. And we look forward to hearing much more of your Torah, Yitz.
Thank you.
As you continue to spread the good word. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody.
Amen.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה. לילה טוב.
Happy Thanksgiving.